one from Tim Gill. We both work in the Research Division at Cambridge University Press and Assessment. And both of these pieces of research are, there's fully published longer versions. I'll show you a screenshot of this one in a minute, which is published in our publication Research Matters, which contains a lot of other pieces of research that we do. And Tim's report as well, if you just Google the title of his report, that will come up as well. That's an externally published report if you need more details on anything that we present. So, two presentations, they're both related to the idea of how long do tests need to be. Within England, the context is there's been a lot of criticism of how much time children spend in exam rooms, particularly at age 16 as part of GCSEs. I think some of this research may have already fed into this debate, but also it's good to just share more detail as those conversations go on. Mine will be fairly theoretical. How long do a test need to be? And then a bit of comparison to other countries. And then Tim's will be put that in very practical terms. What if we made GCSEs shorter in England? So let me try and carry on. So as said before, this is a piece of research that has appeared in Research Matters, and it's called How Long Should a High Stakes Test Be? I have presented it before to some small audiences, so if you have seen it before, or some of the it's a little bit refreshed, but if you've seen it before, apologies. But do hang on for Tim's presentation, which I don't think has ever been presented before, is brand new, so it's worth having a look there. So what are we talking about today? So this is a really simple question. How long should a high stakes test be? We've been doing examinations for over 100 years. We feel we ought to know what the answer to this is. And what I'm going to do in this presentation is try and answer it in two ways. Firstly, I'm going to just look at the academic literature experts in psychometrics. What do they say about how long a test should be? And then, as you might expect, there's a variety of opinions that will come out of that research. So it's interesting to set that against what we see different countries, different jurisdictions within countries doing in practice as a way of reflecting on what's the right way forward. I'm going to focus on large qualifications like GCSEs and A-levels in England. So these are kind of large curriculum-based subjects we have to learn, a lot of skills, a lot of knowledge across a wide curriculum in something like geography or in history. So that's going to be the kind of focus on how long do those need to be. It should be noted that if you've got an assessment, even if it's high stakes and it's very specific, like it's checking how well people have learned to read words, young children have learned to read using phonics, that's a very specific skill. In those cases, clearly you would need a much shorter assessment than I'm going to be recommending in this presentation. This focuses on big qualifications. So first, let's have a look at psychometric approaches to analysis and to this question. So when psychometricians answer the question of test length, they approach it in terms of reliability. So first of all, we need to define what do we mean by reliability. And that is about, reliability is all about consistency we would get in assessment scores if we were to repeat an assessment process. So for example, we're asking the hypothetical question, what if, rather than getting our students to do this particular version of a test, we'd got them to do a different version of the test with different questions. So we're not going to actually measure this. Very rarely do we measure this by actually getting people to do two tests and comparing them. Normally we infer reliability from analysis of questions within a test. For example, a simple way of doing it, although usually we do something more complex than this, is to look at, a simple way would be, let's look at the relationship between all the questions with odd numbers, question 1, 3, 5, and so on, and all the questions with even numbers, question 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on. And by looking at the relationship or the consistency of scores between two half tests, all the odd numbers, all the even numbers, two half-length tests, we can infer something about what the relationship would be between two full-length tests. That's the idea we've got. So that's reliability, about consistency of scores between two replications. And the question we need to ask is, how long does a test need to be to achieve acceptable reliability? So again, I just need to define what we mean by reliability in a little bit more specifically. And most of the ones that we work with, things like Cronbach's alpha, are defined in the following two ways, which are equivalent. One way of defining reliability mathematically is about the proportion of variance in observed scores, which is attributable to variance in true scores. So in other words, mute yourselves if you're not me, that would be good, thank you. So for example, what proportion of the variability in scores that we see is attributable to actual variability in the abilities of candidates? That's one way of defining reliability. Second way is, I think someone just needs to mute themselves, just so we can't hear you snacking. That would be good. Okay, so second way of defining reliability is about correlation between student scores on one test and the scores they would achieve on a parallel test. And by parallel test, we need another test made to the same specifications. In broad terms, a parallel test is one that is equally hard, it's the one we're looking at, and equally long. So we've got these two ways of defining reliability, and they're both about to what extent would people get the same score if we did this again with different questions. Algebraically, it's the only thing I want to come out from this slide is that it's strongly related to this idea of the standard error of measurement. Okay, so you can define reliability from the ratio of the standard error of measurement from the standard deviation of scores. Standard deviation of scores, just the spread of the overall scores that people have. Standard error of measurement, what is the kind of uncertainty around an individual score. So the ratio of those two things is used to define reliability. So that's going to be our main way of looking at reliability to answer how long we need test length to be. But a question, sometimes people think, I would like to think about reliability in a different way. So we might, this is quite a common way, people think, I'd like to think about reliability in terms of what's the chance that people will get the same grade if they did the test again, or if they did another version of the test. And one sort of specific target that was suggested in the academic literature in the 60s and has been repeated several times since then is this idea that people get a grade if they were to redo another version of the test. We couldn't guarantee that they would get the same grade because a lot of candidates are borderline candidates. So, they might fall on the borderline between a C and a B, for example. So we can't guarantee that they won't get a C sometimes and a B the other because they're dead on the borderline. But what we would like is that the grade they are awarded is always within one. They never will get a grade that's more than one different from their true grade. So we articulate that as wanting to have 95% of accurates accurately classified to within plus or minus one grade. And this chart on the right-hand side illustrates this a little bit. We have this idea of candidates having a true score. That is, true scores are defined as the average score the candidate would get if hypothetically they took lots and lots of versions of this test, all the same difficulty, all the same specifications. What would be the average score they would get across all of them? And then around that, there's some distribution of the scores they'll actually achieve on different test versions. And what we want, we imagine all our grade boundaries being fixed because we've decided all these tests are equally difficult, is that 95% of that distribution, this kind of shaded area, is within one grade of the grade that their true score would be awarded. Okay. So we might want to think about how long do we need our test to be to hit a target like this. However, when we try and come up with, go through the logic of trying to answer that question, we do in fact come back to reliability statistics, reliability coefficients, a bit like alpha. So here, I'm just going to show you why that happens. So we might think, I don't want to rely on alpha. I want to work in terms of grading accuracy. If I want to work in terms of grading accuracy, well, I need to think about how accurate are our true scores in relation to the gaps between grades. So I've got my kind of distribution here of observed scores around the true scores, and we need to know how big is that uncertainty in relation to the gaps between, say, getting a grade D and a grade C and so on. So standard error of measurement to bandwidth ratio would where we'd get to next. We'd next think, and this is certainly true in England, that grade bandwidths are set, or where grade boundaries are put, is often predetermined by ideas like comparable outcomes or predictions of how many we expect to get each grade. They're usually set to achieve certain proportions within each grade. However, if we're doing that, then the grade boundaries themselves will move fairly predictably with how much the marks are spread out. If the marks are more spread out, then if we need the same proportions in each grade, we'll have to spread the grade boundaries out more. If the marks are less spread, we'll have to have the grade boundaries closer together in order to get those same proportions in each grade. So grade bandwidths are just a function of the standard deviation. We're interested in standard error of measurement to grade bandwidths, but grade bandwidths are just determined by the standard deviation. Therefore, if we want grading accuracy, we're really thinking about standard error of measurement and how that relates to the standard deviation. And as we've said earlier, hang on, that's really how coefficients like alpha are defined in the first place. So it's all going to be using reliability coefficients like alpha when we try and answer the how long should a test be question. And it's fairly easy to go through some logic that's given. There's more details in the Research Matters paper, that if we assume that the observed grade distribution we're going for is something like a typical GCSE, and we focus that idea of 95% accurate plus or minus 1 on a candidate who is exactly on the grade boundary, then 95% accurate plus or minus 1 grade is going to come meaning the same as having a reliability coefficient of 0.92. So we can turn our target 95% accurate plus or minus 1 grade into a more typical reliability coefficient. So we are able to convert one target for reliability into a reliability coefficient, but what do other people say about what is an acceptable level of reliability? There's 3 quotes I want to go through. Firstly, everyone is clear you can't have an absolute standard for what reliability can be, and that's for good reasons, that these reliability coefficients are not just dependent upon the quality of a test or the length of a test, anything to do with test design. They will also depend on many other things, in particular, the population of students that you do a test with. You'll get a different reliability coefficient if you run a test with a very narrow range of abilities, say just with a group of very, very high ability students, than if you run a test nationally with everyone with a very diverse group. So reliability isn't just about test design, so we have to be a bit careful with them. Nonetheless, second quote, what's happened is over time lots of people have published reliability coefficients for their tests, and we've seen the kind of values that people have achieved, and just as a community tended to agree, okay, things in a range 0.85, 0.95 is going to be highly acceptable. And then there is a little bit more, a caveat on that as well, that we would only need this really high reliability if we're using a test to make decisions about individuals, that is, it really is high stakes for them, and if we haven't got other sources of evidence that are also going to be used to make those decisions. So there's a little bit of reasons why we might accept something a bit lower. So that's kind of the idea, but basically we don't want to be absolutely nailed down, but there are some recommendations, and it's just what people have achieved in the past. Can we use that as a benchmark? So that was just one academic paper giving us a target level for reliability. If you read through the academic literature, various authors have suggested different targets, slightly different targets between 0.8 and 0.95. So here's a range of target reliabilities. Here are the papers. Again, look at the Research Matters article for the actual references to these. These are the papers that suggest these targets, and some notes on what they say. So Evers, for example, says 0.8 describes it as a sufficient level of reliability, and so on. So we've got different targets there, including the 0.92, which was related to that 95% accuracy plus or minus 1 grade, as discussed earlier. So we've got a range of reliability values. Next question would be, how long do we need a test to be to hit each of these reliability values in typical circumstances? So this is what we're going to work on. So in order to answer that question, we're going to use the following things, and I will take you through the evidence for these things in the next few slides. So here's our facts we're going to use. For a typical 50-mark exam, we say reliability tends to be 0.8. We know, using formulas that have been around for over 100 years, how reliability changes with test length. We also know from papers in the 60s and 70s about how qualification reliability changes with added components. That's if you have a qualification where people take more than one exam. We know how putting the scores from those exams together and how many of those exams leading to having more exams leading to a qualification, how that relates to reliability. And when we talk about having more components within a qualification, that's really about, broadly about capturing different abilities, but across a wider range of occasions or topics. Different components would generally be on a different day. So we have more than one occasion that we're measuring the candidate on, maybe a week or two apart, and they might cover slightly different topics. We know as well that typical correlation between these separate exams within the same qualification tends to be at about 0.8. So we're going to put that value into our equations as well. And there's a few little simplifying assumptions we're going to make as well. Again, look at the Research Matters article for more details. So we know we've got a kind of baseline for reliability for an exam, 0.8. We know how reliability changes with test length and with adding more exams. But we want to know about time in terms of duration. How long do exams need to be in time? And to answer that, we're going to say, typically we allow about 1.2 minutes for every mark there is on a test. So that's the final step to get from required reliability to how long we need it to be. So let's just run through those different assumptions. A typical 50-mark test has a reliability of 0.8. I get that from plotting reliabilities of the Cambridge University Press and Assessment exams against the maximum number of marks available. And let's just do this quickly. If we look at a maximum of 50, we get to a typical value of 0.8. And obviously, as you get longer tests, reliability tends to go up. We also know that formula for how reliability changes with test length. And note, this is not the same as the previous slide. The previous slide is about empirically what happens to reliability, in all our exams, as for longer exams and shorter exams. But in that previous slide, where we have a longer exam, it's probably in a different qualification, different type of qualification with a different population to the shorter exam. So there's other things changing as we go up this empirical graph here. It doesn't quite answer if we kept all things equal, but just made a test longer, kept the same population, same kind of design, same kind of grading system and so on, and just made the test longer, what would happen to reliability then? So it's a slightly different thing, and it's called the Spearman-Brown formula, and it just it works in the way that you see here. If you've got a test, here, if you made it twice as long, what would happen to reliability? If you made it half the length, what would happen to reliability? It's got this kind of prophecy formula. It's been around for a long time and is fairly easy to validate by just reanalyzing existing test data. I've also talked about this, I should say, Wang-Stanley formula, and how reliability changes if we add more examinations to a qualification. Two examples here. So if all, this top blue line here with the crosses on it, if all examinations were measuring exactly the same constructs, then this formula is identical to the Spearman-Brown formula. Obviously, you can't go shorter by adding more components because you just have 0 components, but the upwards trajectory is the same as Spearman-Brown. That bottom line shows you what happens if all your components measured completely independent skills, things that had nothing. You had a qualification where you had to do one thing and then you had to do something completely separately, and you were interested in combining scores on both. In that case, your qualification reliability is just equal to the reliability of the components that feed into it. However, that situation is never true in real life. Always ability in one skill is correlated to ability in another. So in a more realistic case is this middle line, imagining the abilities in different skills are fairly highly correlated. And finally, these days we do tend to allow about 1.2 minutes for 70 seconds, for 72 seconds, I guess, for every mark in a test. This just shows how test length in terms of the number of marks available related to duration in the past. So we used to allow about a mark a minute. These days it's more like 1.2 marks a minute if we look at the more recent exams on the right hand panels. So if we put all those things together, 0.8 is a typical level for a 50-mark exam. Spearman-Brown formula for how reliability changes with test length, Wang-Stanley formula for how reliability changes with more examinations, and that for every mark on a test we're going to allow 1.2 minutes in duration. We put all those together, we end up with the following formula for how long you need all the examinations within a qualification to hit a given level of reliability that we're calling alpha qual, and for a given number of components within the qualification that we're calling n. So for example, if we had a qualification with just one exam, so n equals 1, and we wanted our qualification to have a reliability of 0.9, so we put 0.9 in where it says alpha qual, then the required total number of minutes of examinations would be as follows, and we'd work through the formula and we'd end up saying, okay, we need 135 minutes, that is 2 hours and 15 minutes of examinations to hit a reliability of 0.9 under typical circumstances. So that's just one example of how we'd use this formula. If we apply this formula, if you remember all those target reliabilities from earlier, if we apply the formula to all of those, assuming different numbers of components, we get a range of values for how long examinations need to be in minutes. And there's a big range depending on which target we are aiming for. So if we take the lowest bar that's been set within the academic literature, kind of minimum, absolute minimum, we're just aiming to get it sufficiently reliable and no higher at all, then we could justify having one exam an hour long. That's kind of our shortest possible recommendation for a high stakes qualification. However, if we want to take one of these more conservative, more higher bars for reliability, then what we'll need in terms of test lengths will be longer, and it might even go up to almost 6 hours if we look on all this bottom line in terms of how long we need people to do exams for if we're heading for this point, if we want this 0.95 value. So what about GCSEs in England? Well, a typical GCSE in England consists of 3 components. So to hit the Skernick and Nuttall criteria, that's accurate plus or minus 1 grade, or equivalently alpha of 0.92, then we need 199 minutes. That's this value here. That's about 3.5 hours, which interestingly does match the current median duration of a GCSE qualification. So we could look through all our results and come to the conclusion, well done us in England, we've got our qualifications the right length in order to be reliable. So what about if we look at other countries? Why do we start looking at other countries? Well, as we've seen, the psychometric approach gives us a wide range of assessment durations that we could justify if we needed to. So it's easy for that to turn into an exercise in self-justification. However, if instead of this we look at what other countries have done it forces us to reflect more deeply on decisions that have been made. Why might we get a different answer in England about how long exams need to be? Why have we come to a different conclusion than people in other countries? This is a list of jurisdictions that I reviewed. They just were drawn from a list of high-performing jurisdictions from an earlier paper. Again, you can refer to the Research Matters article to find the exact reference where I got this list of countries from. And broadly, when you look across all of these, and I have to say this is just desk-based research, downloading lots of exam papers from these countries, looking at descriptions of what's needed to achieve different qualifications, and then seeing how long are their exams, at the equivalent age to GCSEs and A levels. When I do this, I get two sets of findings. Firstly, let's just start with A levels. So A levels in England done roughly age 18, or the last qualification you do when you're at school before you go to universities. And it's easy to find other countries where the amount of examinations that are done at that age is very similar to what's done in England, particularly across lots of European countries. You have long examinations, as the final examination at school before you go to university. It's nothing too different there. However, GCSEs is different. There is a myth, I haven't heard it so much recently, but it used to go around that other countries don't make 16-year-olds take high stakes exams. And that's clearly not true. Lots and lots do. However, there is a fact that GCSE students in England spend far longer taking assessments than students in similar countries elsewhere. So let's just look at that in a bit more detail. Each GCSE requires about 3.5 hours of exams. Average students in England take about 9 GCSEs. It's a little bit, depends how you count the number of GCSEs, whether you include alternative equivalent qualifications and so on, but broadly 9. So we're talking around about 30 hours of exams for a typical GCSE student. Here's what happens in other countries. So there's a few kind of different categories. There are some countries where each subject is assessed with about the same length of examinations as it is in England. So in Singapore, O levels, number of papers, length of papers in Singapore O levels is not very dissimilar to GCSEs. Or in New Zealand, their National Certificate of Education Achievement, you look through some of their exam papers, they're not very different to GCSEs. But people actually tend to enter less. For example, in Singapore, I think the maximum number of O levels you can do is 8. And most people will tend to enter maybe 6. So overall, it will be a lower assessment burden for the student. Another alternative that makes things shorter is shorter assessments within each subject. So I was quite interested to look at what happens in the Republic of Ireland with their junior certificate, which is at a similar age to GCSEs. So for these qualifications, every junior certificate requires people to do a 2-hour exam for each subject, a single exam, 2 hours long, and then they'll get a few extra additional marks from their teacher based on internal assessment. So shorter assessments within each subject. I should say all this is based on a desk research I did in 2021. Assessment systems change all the time in different countries all around the world, but that's what this is all based on. A more extreme example of different assessment would be something like Chinese Taipei, where you've got the comprehensive assessment program, which is it's basically a selection test for where you go to for the final years of school before university. So it's very high stakes. And what's done there is that students will cover all their exams in a kind of marathon, do all your exams in one day. So there's 7 hours covering 5 subjects, but that's it. Then that's your high stakes assessment done, all in one day. It's a bit similar to the famous university selection test in South Korea. Again, cover all your subjects, but get it all done in one day. A lot of pressure on one day, but it does get it done in a shorter amount of time. So there's lots of alternatives. So why do people have shorter assessments? Well, it's hard to know. might be that you have a narrower construct, that you rely more on just fully multiple choice questions that will allow you to get a reliable, if not a broad, measurement of achievement within a short space of time. Sometimes you might rely purely on internal assessment within a subject, say that we don't need this high stakes external validation for every subject that a 16-year-old studies. That's a different approach some countries might take. Or we might focus on overall achievement. I'm thinking of like these selection tests in East Asia, where the focus is actually on just got one test. We're only going to look at the score overall, not so much within individual subjects, in order to make a choice for who goes to which university or final part of high school. Or do people just think, for the purposes that these tests are used, perhaps we don't need as high a reliability? Perhaps one of those lower levels of reliability is sufficient. So I'm not going to finish with a conclusion. I'm just going to finish with a reflection. It's easy to justify our current test designs. I can certainly say from the research that the lengths of tests in England are long enough to get good reliability statistics. That's undoubtedly true. But there's kind of an open question. Why is it that 16-year-olds in England need to spend more time taking exams than those elsewhere? And kind of sub-question to that, is the amount of time that they take in exams proportionate to the purposes of the test? That's an open question. People have different opinions. But I'm going to leave you with that to reflect on. We can have more discussion at the end. But before we get there, I think it's good to see Tim's ideas relating to all this. So I'll hand over to him.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Tom. I'll just share my screen. A second. Right. Yeah. So I am talking about the impact on reducing the number of exams on results in GCSEs. So something slightly different. Starting with a bit of background. So there's been a growing concern among many people about the amount of time that students in England spend taking GCSE exams, and whether we're putting an unnecessary burden on them. According to a House of Lords report, most students have more than 30 hours of exams in a 4-week period. And this amount of time can be demotivating, and particularly so for students who are already struggling, for example, low attainers. Furthermore, with so many exams, there is also a potential problem of too much focus on the narrow range of learning needed to pass the exam. But the obvious question that follows from this is whether the current volume of exams is necessary, or would it be possible to reduce the number of exams and still have reliable results? And as Thomas mentioned, the longer a test, the more reliable. And the same goes for the number of exams in a subject. So more exams generally means more reliability, but that doesn't necessarily mean we should aim for more tests, because we have to balance reliability against the burden on learners. So the purpose of the research I'm presenting today was to investigate this by looking at the impact of reducing the number of exams, or more specifically, the number of components in a qualification, on the grades achieved by students. Before I get to that, just worth mentioning some previous research related to this that I did back in 2020, which investigated the accuracy of just using one component to grade students. This was following the cancellation of all exams in that year because of COVID, and I investigated what would happen if it was only possible for students to sit one exam in the following year because of the pandemic. And I found that across GCSE subjects, the average percentage of students getting the same grade from only one component was 51.6%, and the average percentage who would be within one grade was 93.2%. I also found that the highest percentages were in maths, between 65 and 75% getting the same grade, and around 99% within one grade. In the research I'm presenting today, I was looking at less drastic scenarios in terms of reducing the number of components. So these are my research questions. So yeah, what would be the impact on GCSE grades of reducing the number of components? And then secondly, I looked at whether the impact of doing this would be different for different groups of students. And if this was found to be the case, this would warrant further investigation to see whether some students would be disadvantaged by this. So for this research, I used data from the OCR awarding body on GCSE exam results in the June 2024 exam series. And this data included the marks and grades achieved by every student in every component in each subject, and then the overall grade achieved in the subject as well. For anyone not familiar with GCSE components, all single-sized GCSEs are comprised of either 2 or 3 components. Mostly these components are compulsory, so every candidate must take all components in order to achieve the qualification. For my analysis, I started by investigating all GCSEs offered by OCR, which had 3 compulsory components. And this enabled me to investigate the impact on results of reducing the number of components to 2. So I didn't look at GCSEs where there was some choice in terms of which components were taken. And I also didn't look at the GCSE subjects which had 2 components only. And this was because the impact in these subjects of reducing the number of components to just 1 had already been investigated in my previous research. So these are the subjects that I did include in terms of the ones with 3 components. And then I also looked at combined science GCSEs. So OCR offers 2 different versions of combined science, which are generally referred to as combined science A and combined science B. And these are both worth 2 GCSEs, which is why combined science A has 6 components and combined science B has 4. And for these subjects, I investigated the impact of reducing the number of components from 6 to 3 and from 4 to 3. So most GCSE components are assessed by an exam. However, some subjects include components which are non-exam assessed, or NEA. In the GCSEs I was looking at, both drama and music consist of 2 NEA components and 1 exam component, and PE is 1 NEA component and 2 exam components. So moving on to the method. So simply put, I basically compared the aggregated grades from a reduced set of components with the actual grades from the full qualification. So what does this mean? In the subjects with 3 components, I investigated the impact of reducing the number of components to 2, and this gave 3 possible combinations of 2 components, i.e. components 1 and 2, 1 and 3, and 2 and 3. For the 2 combined science qualifications, the reduced sets of components investigated were based on the most plausible reductions given the structure of the qualifications. So in combined science A, there are currently 6 components, 2 for each of biology, chemistry, and physics. It therefore made sense to investigate the impact of reducing this to 1 component per topic. And so all possible combinations of 3 components were investigated, with the additional restriction that there was 1 component in each subject. This gave a total of 8 possible combinations. For combined science B, there are 4 exams, 1 for each of biology, chemistry, and physics, and an exam which assesses all subjects together. And here it made sense to investigate the impact of removing the combined exam so that 1 exam for each topic was still included. This meant there was only 1 possible set of components to investigate. Both maths and combined science subjects are tiered. For anyone not familiar with this concept, this means that for each component, there are 2 different exams, which are different levels of difficulty. And each student will only sit 1 of them depending on their teacher's assessment of their ability level. So more able candidates will be allocated to the more difficult higher tier exam, and less able candidates will be directed towards the foundation tier. And the higher grades, specifically grades 6 to 9, are only available to students using the higher tier exams. So for the tiered subjects, 2 different analyses were undertaken, 1 for the foundation tier components and 1 for the higher tier components. I'm now going to just briefly explain how I calculated the aggregated grade achieved by students on the reduced set of components. This was done by basically adding up the marks achieved in the reduced set of components and comparing that to the sum of the grade boundary marks in these components. So, for example, this table shows the 3 components taken by a student in a particular subject to achieve the full qualification. On the left of the table are the grade boundary marks for grades 7 and 8 on each component. And then to get the overall grade boundary marks, we just add up the component grade boundary marks and get totals 145 and 195. Then on the right-hand side, we have candidate performance on the components. And you can see this student achieved a mark of 69 on component 4, 62 on component 5, and 60 on component 6, giving component level grades of 8, 7, and 7. And then their overall mark was 191, meaning they got a grade 7 overall. So what I did then was, for each combination of 2 components, I added up the grade boundary marks and the candidate marks. So for the first combination of 2 components, which was components 4 and 5, the aggregated grade 7 boundary is 49 add 49, which gives 98. The aggregated grade 8 boundary is 65 and 65, or 130. This candidate achieved an aggregated mark from these 2 components of 131, giving them a grade of 8 on this combination of components. And this was different from their overall grade, which was a 7. And then we just do the same for the other combinations. And you can see this student would get the same grade as their overall grade if components 4 and 6 were used, or components 5 and 6, but they would get a different grade, they'd get a different grade if components 4 and 5 were used. So after doing this calculation for every student, I used 3 different measures to assess how the grades achieved in the reduced number of components compared to the overall grade for each candidate. So these measures were, firstly, the percentage of students who achieved the same aggregated grade in the reduced set of components as overall qualification grade, percentage of students achieving a grade in the reduced set of components which was within 1 grade of the qualification grade, and then the correlation between their grade on the reduced set of components and their overall grade. And then each of these measures was calculated a second time after adjusting the aggregated grade boundary marks from the reduced set of components, so that the percentage of students achieving each grade was as close as possible to the actual percentage in the whole qualification. So this basically simulated a situation where students are graded based on their performance in the reduced set of components, whilst ensuring that the overall standard remained the same as if they took the whole qualification. And finally, I looked at whether the impact of reducing the number of exams would be different for different groups of students. So for this, I looked at differences between genders and between school types. Ideally, I would like to look at more factors, but this is all of the data that I actually had access to. Okay, moving on to the results, and starting with the 3 component GCSEs. So this chart shows the percentage of students receiving the same grade from each combination of 2 components as they did from the whole qualification. So for each subject, each marker indicates the percentage for 1 combination, and each subject has 3 possible combinations. The dotted line shows the mean percentage across the 3 different combinations, and the subjects are sorted from left to right by this mean value. And this is after making the adjustment to the grade boundary marks, as I described earlier. So at the top end, we've got maths, where the percentages getting the same grade were all around 85%. In geography and citizenship, the percentages were around 70 to 75%. I should say that OCR has two different specifications for geography, which is why there are 2 different geographies. And then we've got lower percentages for drama, music, and PE. And these circled markers were the combinations of two components which included at least one NEA component. That's not non-exam assessed. So you can see that these percentages tended to be lower. In terms of the combined science qualifications, so as I mentioned, I've split these by tier. So there are two for each subject, one for foundation tier, one for higher tier. Just a reminder that in combined science B, which is on the left-hand side of the graph, I only looked at one reduced set of three components after removing the combined exam. So there's only one marker on the figure for combined science B. In combined science A, there were 8 possible combinations of the three components, but as you can see, the results were all very similar for each combination. So you can see that the percentages getting the same grade were higher for combined science B than for combined science A. And this may be at least partly because the marks from each set of components I investigated in science B made up a much higher percentage of the overall qualification marks than in science A. So the science B set was 79% of the overall, compared with just 50% for each set in combined science A. In both qualifications, the higher tier percentages were lower than foundation tier. This may be partly because there are more grades available on the higher tier. So it's also worth looking in a bit more detail at which candidates are most likely to get the same grade. This figure here shows the percentage of those on each mark point who would have received the same grade with a reduced set of components. This is for the maths foundation tier components. So each line represents one combination of two components, and the vertical lines indicate the grade boundary mark points. So not surprisingly, the percentages are much slower around the grade boundary marks and get much higher in the middle of each grade. So they were close to 100% in the middle of the grade boundary and around 50% at the grade boundary mark points. So what this really shows is that even with highly reliable exams such as maths, there will always be some candidates who are very close to the overall grade boundary and therefore more likely to get a different grade from the reduced set of exams. And it's for this reason that I decided to also look at the percentages of candidates who are within one grade of their actual grade when using the reduced set of components. And that's what I'm going to look at now. So yeah, again, starting with the GCSEs with three components. This figure here shows the percentage within one grade of their actual grade using the reduced set of components. As you can see, these percentages were all very high, all above 90% and mostly above 95%. The highest percentages were in maths again. These were all above 99.9%. Lowest average was in PE, but this was still 95.8% on average. And this one combination, which was lower than the rest, was the combination of music components, which consisted of both non-examined assessed components. And these are the results for the combined science subjects. And again, the percentages were very high, all above 95%. Just a quick note about the correlations between the grade on the reduced set of components and the overall qualification grade. I'm not going to go into these in detail, but the correlations are shown in these two tables here for the three components GCSEs and for the combined science GCSEs. And you can see that the correlations were all very high, all above 0.9, and most were above 0.95.
While we're waiting, I'll try and answer a few of the queries while Tim gets set up. I think we've tried to answer a lot of these in the chat as I've gone along. Let's just see if there's any that I haven't answered at all. Computer versus paper was a question that we're getting asked. So we haven't looked at that. Everything we're looking at today is paper based. So yeah, that would be an interesting thing for future research, but not one we've looked at here yeah, obviously there's new opportunities with digital tests, but obviously a lot of challenges as well. So that'll be something to look at later. And another question we've got here: not all components assess the same constructs. That's absolutely true. So condensing two things into a single exam. So somewhat we've looked at this. So we've certainly, I mean, that more relates to the one I was looking at, where you kind of shorten each exam rather than take out whole components. What I think is interesting about Tim's research is that even if you do the most straightforward kind of brutal, let's take out a whole component as is, not have it anymore, you still end up with some fairly consistent results with what we have at the moment. So it's kind of taking almost a worst case scenario and looking at that. But yeah, we have looked at what happens if you shorten exams within components and what difference that makes. And yeah, obviously that's better if you do it that way. So we have looked at it a bit, or at least in related things, but clearly in practice you would want to do something more nuanced in terms of condensing what you've got into a smaller number of components. Okay, I think
Tim's back in.
Okay, Tim, I've just been answering questions a little bit, but if you're ready to pick up, perhaps you'd like to.
Oh, let me just. Should be here.
In the meantime, what we've got here is another question. Is the relationship with the body of content being assessed? That is, if we set an assessment at a length to be reliable, but the body of content is very large. Yes, so that's exactly what we're getting at. So all the GCSEs and A-levels do have a very large body of content, which is why I think they do need larger exams than something very small, like and I mentioned right at the start, the phonics reading check. So it does matter. That's certainly an interesting, I mean, it's a separate conversation, but definitely an interesting one. But even with what we've got, we could, you know, if we just take what we've got in terms of the current curriculum base, there's a chance for being shorted. I think, Simon, have you got your hand up? Would you like to say something? Perhaps not. Okay.
Tucked out of the meeting about 5 minutes before the end, so my apologies for that.
Oh, not
I
to
asked
worry. We all got kicked out. We're gonna pick it up again in a second. But yes, you asked a question. Yes.
Okay. I asked a question in the chat. I didn't realise it was the wrong place to ask it. I should have put it in the Q&A. But what I wrote was, of the countries that take GCSE level assessments, how many supplement their overall grading with a grade point average style of report for their students? And is this a factor?
Well, I'm trying to work on memory. I don't think that's that common to put it into a grade point average. What they will tend to supplement it with is more, they'll have some internal assessment that will come together to make the overall grade. I don't think grade point averages are that common outside of the US states, but no, certainly you get a result for each subject in and indeed the East Asia, those kind of selection tests, they'll be reported as more of a grade point average, but most of it's a result in a subject. Yeah.
I guess the reason for asking it is that the research that was done by Charles Clark and the OCR head, I think, seemed to imply that we set an enormous number of hours of exams compared to these other countries, and one in particular was the US. And I just felt it was an unfair comparison because I didn't think they were taking all of the kind of assessment that's done for each student into place. They were only looking at external assessments.
Sure, I understand what you're saying. Yes, so a lot of people, I mean, that's right. A lot of people supplement with high school assessments or with something internal as well as something external as well. Yeah, so there's whole structural differences as well, but you know, certainly even if you take that, it's difficult to find other countries that do this amount of externally controlled high stakes assessment. there's still a big difference there from everyone else. So it's, you know, it's not that there's something wrong. It's not like, you know, there's necessarily England's doing anything wrong. We've said it's good, reliable assessment. It's just to reflect on. That's the point of it, really. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Tom, shall I get
So,
started again?
oh yeah, go.
Yes, go for it.
Yeah. So, so this is now looking at the second research question, which was whether there was any evidence that the effect of reducing the number of components would be different for different groups of students. Starting with the GCSEs with 3 components, and in terms of gender, this chart shows the average percentage achieving the same grade from the reduced set of components as they did on the full qualification. The diamond shape is for female students and the circle is for male students. And this is averaged across all the possible reduced sets of components in the subject. As you can see, there was almost no difference in these percentages between males and females. Similarly, for school type, again, this compares the average percentage for state school students and for independent or selective school students. And again, there was almost no difference in these percentages. Similarly, for the combined science subjects, we've got almost no difference between the groups in either gender or school type. And just in conclusion then, so the percentage of students achieving the same grade from the reduced set of components varied from 46% to 87%, depending on the subject. Percentages within one grade were all very high, above 90% in all subjects, and mostly above 95%. Similarly, the correlations between grades on the reduced set of components and overall grade were very, very high, above 90.95 in most cases. So this suggests that there were not big changes in the rank order of students when using the reduced set of components. The highest percentage getting the same grade were in maths with around 85% and over 99.9% within one grade. This may be partly due to the fact that maths has a different structure from other subjects in terms of what is assessed in each component. So in maths, all topics are examined in all 3 components. So this means that candidate strengths and weaknesses will likely cancel out within each component, and therefore performance will be quite similar between pairs of components. In other subjects, each component focuses on a different topic or set of topics, and therefore students may not perform as consistently across components. Subjects with some non-examined assessment had lower percentages achieving the same grade, and this is likely to be because candidates tended to get substantially higher grades in NEA than in examined components. Therefore, the component combinations which included an NEA component were more likely to give candidates higher grades than they achieved in the overall qualification. It was reassuring that there was no evidence that different groups of students would be impacted differently by reducing the number of components. This meant that there was no need for any further investigation to see if any students would be disadvantaged. So overall, my results suggest that reducing the number of components will not lead to a big drop in the reliability of the grades, particularly in subjects such as maths, and particularly if we consider reliability in terms of the percentage who would have got a grade within one of their overall grade. It would therefore be something worth considering as a way of reducing the exam burden on students. And that's where I'm going to finish my presentation.
Thanks, Tim. That was great. If anyone has time to stay on, if there are more questions, please do come unmute or put them in the chat. I think, have we answered everything in the Q&A?
I believe we have gone through all of those. I mean, some of them were clarification questions, and I think they've all been, yeah, they've all been answered. So yeah, that's fine. I'm not seeing anyone raising their hand for any more comments. Just give it a second. But otherwise, I think we can call that done. So thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, thanks everyone,
Yeah,
and do get in
sorry
touch if you have
for
questions.
losing internet, and sorry for losing internet in the middle there, but I hope you still got most of the information across. So thanks again.